probably know my name's Larry. That's probably all you want to know about me. But anyway, we're going to be looking this morning at the 23rd Psalm. So I'd like for us to read it together, and then we're just going to look a little more closely at it. So I think it's on the screen there. And feel free to read it out loud with me. It may be a little different version than what you're used to, but it's a passage that just kind of warrants reading together as a church family. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You've anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, when you see this passage, especially in print, you may be reminded of the most recent funeral you went to, because it seems like that's the only place you usually see this passage printed, and it's probably what has to be in the top 2 or 3 most familiar passages in the Bible, whether you grew up in a church or not. Most everybody knows something about the 23rd Psalm. And I think for that reason, oftentimes it's neglected to really teach from it or to look more carefully at it because it's so familiar. Most teachers or preachers like the challenge of taking a less familiar passage and talking about it. But we're going to look at the familiar this morning. And hopefully maybe God will give us some fresh ways of looking at it and applying it to our lives. So there's been a lot of debate among scholars about when this was written in David's life. I like the idea and the theory that it was written when he was an older man towards the end of his life, as he was reflecting on his life and what life with God was like. It occurred to him how much it was God's relationship to him was so much like his relationship to the sheep when he was a young boy in the shepherding fields of Palestine in the family of Jesse. We remember that he was the youngest of 8 boys in the family, and there's a reason why David was the guy who was missing when Samuel came looking for the guy to anoint as the next king. He said, "No, it's none of these. Don't you have another son?" "Oh yeah, that's David. He's out tending the sheep." Well, the youngest kid always got to tend the sheep because it was the dirtiest, smelliest job, and the older brothers were always looking for somebody to pass that on to, and usually the youngest brother got caught holding that responsibility. So David had lots of time out in the wilderness with the sheep, and this solitude and this time by himself became an incredible schoolroom for David to learn about God, to learn about life, and to reflect on what it was like to know his Creator. I really believe that with all of David's writing, and he wrote many of the Psalms. I'm not sure if it's most, but I think probably most of the Psalms were written by David. This is probably the pinnacle. This is what sums up all of David's teaching about God and his relationship with God, and just boils it down to what meant the most to him. I really believe that's what this psalm was all about. But David had spent countless hours and days in the wilderness. This wilderness, we need to try to picture it in our minds. It was rugged, it was barren, it was dangerous, it was a place of wild, threatening animals. To a sheep, it was all of these things. It was confusing to them. Where do we go? It was a parched land, oftentimes not obviously giving the resources that were needed. But to the shepherd, it was home with the sheep. And it was his job to care for the sheep. And this became a template in David's mind of what it was like when God cared for him. David begins the psalm with this simple statement: the Lord is my shepherd. Now, we sometimes skip over words and don't think about the significance of them, but David was a little possessive, wasn't he? Saying the Lord is my shepherd. Let's think about that. You would think he would say the Lord is our shepherd, be a little more inclusive. Isn't that the thing we like these days? We're going to be all inclusive, but won't go there. So anyway, the Lord is my shepherd. I think this is the way David really thought of him, and I think this is the way David wants us to think about the Lord's relationship to us. We too often put human limitations on God's ability to do his job in our lives. If you think about, for example, the story that Jesus told about the 99 sheep that were left in the fold because the shepherd had one sheep that was lost, and he went out looking for that lost sheep. And in our minds, we're thinking, boy, I hope there's somebody back looking after those 99 and keeping them safe while he goes out and looking for the lost sheep. And we put human limitations on God. The fact is, we forget some of the earliest lessons we learned about the nature of God, and they don't really sink in the implications of what he is, what God is like. Remember those omni words? Omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, the God who can't create a rock too big that he can't move it. We won't go into the philosophical aspect of that, but God is omni, all these things, especially the omnipresent. God can be at many places at one time. He can give attention to the sheep that's lost and still be giving individual care to the 99 still in the fold. And God can give individual care to every person in the world at the same time, because he's not limited by time and space and by location the way a person is. And so we can truly say the Lord is my shepherd. He can treat me as if I'm the only person in the world, because he is not limited by what regular people are limited by. We don't have to worry about getting God's attention like, oh God, you're paying too much attention to these people over here. I need a little attention. It's a silly way of looking at God that's because we see things through human eyes. God can be everyone in the world who wants to and who will look to him and call out on him can have God as their personal shepherd, as if they're the only people in the world. God can do all of that and still has spare time. God still has time for all of his hobbies, even after he's done everything he needs to for his people. Did you know God had hobbies? Well, I think he does. We know that one of them was he was a bird watcher. Look at Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 and 30. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care? And I know I've been on some farms where there's a lot of sparrows. We used to try to reduce the population. But anyway, you get the point. And he still counts hairs on a head. God can do some things that seem so trivial to us because he can do everything that's necessary and important and still have time to spare because he's not limited by time. So you get the point. God certainly wants to be your personal shepherd. David is writing this psalm in a spirit of an enthusiastic recommendation. Are you looking for your way through life? Are you trying to figure out where to go and what to do and how to live the best life possible? Here's what I recommend. Here is the way. Because the Lord was my shepherd, and he can be your shepherd as well. Now, David begins the sermon, I think, giving his introduction, or this passage, his introduction, because he makes a statement that really sums up everything else he's going to say in the psalm. He said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, let's think of how that word was used, because he didn't use it the way we think of wanting. When we think of wanting, we think of when we were kids and we made that list for Santa Claus. That's what we want, all the things we wish for, the things we would like to have. And this is used more of in an older fashioned sense of the word. Want simply meant need, meant something that you had to have, something that was necessary for life. And David said, I will never be in need with the Lord as my shepherd about anything. And that covers a whole lot of areas that we'll get into. Paul echoes that thought in the New Testament in Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. And my God will supply all of your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. What a promise. We just kind of glaze over and read over it quickly and don't really think of how that applies and how deeply it can be applied. One of the challenges of faith, I think, that's very basic to all of us is simply believing that God knows what I need more than I do. He knows me better than I do. He knows what I need because the things that I think I need are not necessarily what he thinks I need, and we have to learn to trust him enough to know that he's going to do that. Now, if you're a parent, you know exactly what we're talking about. Is your list of needs for your child the same as what they think they need? Usually there's a difference in what they think they would like or want compared to what you know that they need, and so it's hard to get your child to trust you to say no to those things that they really think they need, but they're really just desires or things that they would like to have. It should not surprise us to realize that the Good Shepherd thinks we need some things more than what we think we need them. You know, he kind of thinks we need more of some things that we tend to neglect. He thinks we need more of wisdom and knowledge of his word. He thinks we need a little more virtue in our lives, and we kind of want just enough to get by, don't we? Just so we can kind of feel good about ourselves and sleep well at night. But he would like us to have more. He'd like us to have a little less of some other things that we spend most of our time going after. Things like stuff, good times, popularity, or a reputation that people admire and look up to. Those are the things we kind of want, that we would like to have, and God says, not so much. You know, maybe you get a little too much of these things, and that could ruin you. So God's priorities are different than ours are. But we need to get a little more specific as David breaks down the ways that his shepherd shepherded his life. Let's look at what exactly he provided for him. So he goes on to say, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. The most basic job of the shepherd was to take care of his sheep so they wouldn't die. That was to keep them alive. And that was done by leading them to food and to drink. The quiet waters. I've read that sheep don't like a running water. They don't like the typical rippling brook. They like a place where they're not going to be disturbed by the moving water. They like a still pool. So the shepherd had to understand those things about a sheep. But what do you picture in your mind when we consider the green pastures? Do you think of a green pasture in Missouri? We've got the wrong idea. I'd like to have a short video clip by a guy named Ray Vanderlaan. He's a Bible teacher, especially about the Holy Land. And let's see what he had to say about green pastures.
As part of the shepherd lesson, I did want to look at one thing in the wilderness that will maybe surprise you a bit. Believe it or not, this is called wilderness, midbar, but it's also called green pastures. Now, when you take a Westerner here the first time and you look at this, you find people say, well, I don't know that I can go there, because the Psalm 23, the Lord leads me into green pastures, has been pictured as belly-deep alfalfa. Well, you haven't seen any belly-deep alfalfa. And from biblical time to today, it's rare to see a flock in the farm country. There isn't a lot of farm country in this culture, and so farmers kept the shepherds out as much as they could. Maybe they would come in a little bit after the harvest to glean what was left, but you don't want sheep where you can farm. This is the land of the shepherd. Right on the hillside across from us, you can see those grazing trails, cut there by sheep maybe as long ago as Abraham's time. They're spaced so that an animal on one path and an animal on another can reach right to the middle between them. That determines the distance, so you can graze an entire hillside. And the shepherds lead their sheep across that hillside slowly, grazing what's there? Now, you look at it from here and you say, what's there? In fact, I remember my first impression. I woke up one morning, I was sleeping out in the wilderness, and I remember waking up, watching a flock of sheep on a hillside like this, and my feeling was, what are those, rock-eating sheep? I mean, what do they eat? How can you call this green pastures? Well, the answer is, there's a small amount of moisture present here. They get a little bit of rain every year. Not much, but a little. Second, there is humidity in the air, especially in the evening breeze, like right now, you can feel it coming from the west off the Mediterranean. There's moisture in the air. That moisture, combination of the rain and the humidity, condenses or drips along the edge of these rocks here. And if you notice, right around the rocks, almost always next to the rocks, you get little tufts of green. Get one a moment. That's what we refer to as the green pastures. So the shepherd looks for a hillside. That's exactly what she was doing. Look at that flock across from us there. Just stunning. Those two shepherd girls have found a hillside that either was exposed to the wind or had that small amount of rain. And they move that flock across the hillside, and it's one mouthful here, walk a step or two, another mouthful, another mouthful, another mouthful. Now that changes the green pasture image a little bit, besides the picture changing radically. Green pastures are not everything you need for the rest of your life. If you make that belly deep alfalfa, then what God is saying, if you follow me, I'm going to plunk you down and you'll never have to move an inch the rest of your life. Just reach out and grab it. Tell me that your life with God has been like that. Worry, said one rabbi, is dealing with tomorrow's problems on today's pasture. In the desert, you learn the shepherd will get you what you need for right now. 10 minutes from now, you trust the shepherd. Just enough.
Kind of changes your idea of what maybe God promises for us, doesn't it? Now, of course, we can apply this at every level of our lives. Obviously, we need food, we need drink, and yet there are so many other things that we need that sheep don't need so much of. We need hope, don't we? We need encouragement. And maybe there are times in your life where you feel like you're in a barren land. You feel like you're in the desert of your life because of the circumstances you find yourself in. You find yourself very discouraged and starved inside for that hope you want. If we ask the shepherd, is he going to plop us in the middle of that belly-deep alfalfa, to be able to feed? Maybe not. Maybe he's going to give us that little tuft of grass here and that little bite of nourishment there in ways that if we look for them, we'll find them. But if we're still looking for that green pasture that you'd see on a hillside in Missouri, we may miss what God really is providing for us. Maybe it's a Bible verse that comes to mind with a promise that really speaks to us at that moment. Maybe it's a call from a friend to just remind us that we're being thought of by someone. Maybe it's your dog runs up to you with their tail wagging, and you realize that the world is not all bad. There's still this friendly animal that in my life. But small ways that God shows that he's not forgotten us, and he wants to show us in so many ways that you could easily walk right over if you're looking for your idea of a green pasture. Psalm 37, verse 25 says, I've been young and now I'm old, yet I've not seen the righteous forsaken or his descendants begging bread. I love the story told by, it's an old book on prayer by an author named E.M. Bounds. He was just talking about how reliable prayer had been in his life, but he talked about the life of a man named George Mueller. George Mueller, his ministry was to orphans, and he made a promise to God and to his family that he would never solicit for money or for the needs of that orphanage except to God. And he always prayed for the needs of the orphans. And there are stories told of him sitting down at the table in the house with not a bit of food in the whole house, gathered around the table with his family and his orphan family, praying thanks for the food that God was going to provide. And a lot of strange things happened, like a truck pulling up to the house, or a wagon, I guess, back in those days, with some surplus meat from the locker or from the butcher down the road, or from the baker, some surplus bread. And things would come to them just in a timely manner, and gives meaning to that saying, God is seldom early, but he's never late to meet our needs. I'm sure many of you could tell stories of how God provided for you different times in the years when things were really tight, whether it was on a physical, food level, emotional, in different ways like that. We really think that we would like to, and we work for this, and I have to confess, I've done the same thing. We would like to have enough supplied so that we don't have to pray for today's daily bread. We would like to have it all right there in place where we don't have to move an inch. But Jesus warned us that the moth destroys, the thieves break in and steal, and there's so many ways that in this life, the resources that we want to count on can be depleted, can evaporate, can go away. And this is the temptation of the rich man, Proverbs 18:12. A rich man's wealth is his fortified city. It's like a high wall in his own imagination. He thinks, this is all I need. This is going to protect me from the threats of life because I got plenty of resources behind this wall. But it's an illusion, isn't it? It's the blessing of the Lord that makes rich, he says further down in that proverb, and he adds no sorrow to it. So it's not trusting what God supplies, it's trusting the God who supplies it, and there's a big difference, and it's a tough lesson to learn. Next, David goes on to say, my shepherd will meet your need to restore your soul. Now, we've talked about this a little bit, but isn't it true that there are days when we feel like we're on top of the world and that God is good and the world is good, and there are days when we just feel like it's all gone. It's just like a balloon that's deflated. I remember a funny story one time about a lady who loved to come forward on Sunday morning, and her wish when she would come forward was always the same. She would come forward, kneel at the altar, and in a loud voice she'd say, Lord, fill me, because she was empty, I'm sure. And she would do that week after week, and finally about the third week, the people in the congregation were getting a little impatient with her. And when she knelt down and said, Lord, fill me, somebody at the back of the auditorium said, Lord, don't do it, she leaks. So anyway, we all leak, don't we? And we get punctured. We have things that happen and hit our lives where the devil wants to discourage us, where he wants to make us feel alone and abandoned and empty. And we need to have our soul restored. And David promises that this is what God will do. Many of the Psalms you read, you get the idea that David really had a battle with depression. And I'm sure that's true, but he found his answers. I think God allowed him to have this thirst because he found that God could fill that thirst. Now, as we get into the next point, we need to realize there's a close link between having our soul restored and having our life on the right track. And this next thought about the paths of righteousness, I think, really ties in here in a very, very important way. When Cain had a depleted soul, or his soul needed to be restored, the Lord said to Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, why are you angry, and why is your face downcast or gloomy? If you do well, will your face not be cheerful? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desires for you, but you must master it. Now that's when Abel was still alive, and we know that Cain made the wrong choice, and he paid the price for it the rest of his life. So we get into this idea of righteousness, and it's a big, tough subject, but let's just see what we can glean from what David is saying here. A Christian must always think of righteousness in two aspects. First of all, the righteousness that implies our standing before God, and we call that salvation or justification. And David found that God justified and forgave his sins. And that's an important thing that's the basic thing that girds up our life. But then there's also a second aspect of righteousness, and that's righteous practice. How do we live our daily lives once we've been justified? And the shepherd wants us to do more than just be forgiven. He wants to change our lives and lead us in paths of righteousness. There's a great promise in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 31. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They will mount up with wings as eagles. They will run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so when we follow the Good Shepherd, this is the benefit, what he does for us. But David goes on to the practical part of this restored soul by seeing that the Good Shepherd wants to guide his life in righteous paths. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. We saw the paths, didn't we? In the story we saw, the video. And David saw those as symbolic of righteous paths that God wants to lead us in our lives so that he can keep us safe. Mahatma Gandhi, a well-known historical leader of India, who never professed to be a Christian, but he said this one time about Christians. He said, "I like your Christ, but not your Christianity." And David said, "Lead me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." When we bear the name of Christ, the only thing people know about God sometimes is what they see in us and how we live, and how important it is for us to remember that as we seek to let God guide us in righteous paths. Now, the type of shepherding that David was involved in is important to realize, because there were two types of shepherding. There was the shepherd who literally herded the sheep. He might have had a dog or somebody to nip at the heels of the sheep to get them to go where they needed to go. But then there's the kind of shepherding where the shepherd is more of a friend to the sheep, and he uses his voice. He actually calls the sheep know his voice, and that's what Jesus was referring to in John chapter 10, verse 27. "My sheep listen to my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." So we need to learn to hear the voice of Jesus through his word, through the counsel of friends, through prayer, and ways that God can guide us in righteous paths. Now, there are many, many confusing voices that we hear in our world today that I think bear some examination. Things that have become popular and are presented to us as righteous paths by the secular world, and they're so close to being righteous that we can often mistake them for the real thing, but they're a counterfeit and they're deadly. I'd like to introduce that thought by an old quote from a guy. He was kind of the C.S. Lewis, if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, of his day 100 years ago in England, before Lewis came along, but a great influence on him. G.K. Chesterton said this: "The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad, and they do terrible things. The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from each other." And focus in on that idea, isolated virtues, and they're wandering alone. And that's what makes them deadly. Now I want to just refer to a couple that I think we're all pretty familiar with. That we've seen them in the news. I'm not going to try to get political at all. I just want to examine these things on their own merit. But one of the virtues that's gone astray and gone mad in our society is love. Love by itself, the desire to take care of people, the desire to give to people without expecting anything in return, the desire to take care of people from cradle to grave because we think that's the loving thing to do. And it's hard to argue with it at first, but there's something in our gut that just feels queasy and it's like, well, there's something wrong with that, isn't there? And then there's the solo virtue that we hear about, and I would call it justice, that's gone astray. So we have a monument to somebody who did some great things, and we commemorate it, and we find out that that person wasn't perfect, that that person had slaves, or that person did this or that was bad, and so now let's wipe them out of our memory. Let's just get rid of them altogether because they don't measure up. Or even a living person who you find that they wrote something or said something 20 years ago that maybe they've learned better by now, but that doesn't count. Let's penalize them for the rest of their lives. Let's judge them and condemn them and ostracize them because they've done this thing. And I would call that justice gone mad, and justice that has gone wild. And we as Christians need to know how to answer and evaluate those kinds of ways our society is imposing their idea of virtue on our world. On the surface, they seem okay, but there's something wrong with them. The reality is that the Christian virtues, as Chesterton said, they're running alone. They were never intended to run alone. Christian virtues were always intended to be balanced by other virtues, to be life-giving instead of destructive. So with love, would practice wisely, it has to be practiced with responsibility and accountability. Any parent knows that. Just give your child what they want and what they need without ever expecting any chores, without ever expecting any responsibility on their part. Just give them a blank check, let them have what they want or what they need, and then enjoy them for the rest of your life, because they'll be in their basement when they're 40 years old, still living off of you, because they won't know how to take care of themselves and they won't think they should have to. They'll feel entitled, won't they? And we're trying to create a nation of entitled people, and that's not right on any level, whether it's in a family or whether it's in a nation. It's love gone mad and misapplied. The same is true of justice. When not properly combined with grace, it isn't designed to correct or improve people, it destroys them. So many are trying to wield this virtue in self-righteous arrogance, and it really is. And it's only going to destroy everybody involved, the people that it's intended to correct and the people who dish it out. So I want to think of a good illustration to show what I'm talking about. So love, justice, I would call those elemental virtues. They're basic virtues of Christianity. But you know, if you look at how God created elements in the physical world, and we've kind of learned that there's 100 and some elements in the physical world, they were never designed to be on their own. They're always combined with something else to create something worthwhile. I want us to think of two of the most common elements in the physical world: hydrogen and oxygen. Now, this is not a science lesson, but maybe a little bit. Okay, so bear with me. So what is hydrogen like when it's by itself? How safe is it? Ask the people who were riding in the Hindenburg, a dirigible, back in May 6 of 1937. When it blew up, 36 people burned to death and many others injured in an environment of pure hydrogen. How safe is oxygen? Well, there were three guys named Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on January 27th, 1967, who are not around to tell how dangerous that pure environment of oxygen was, but it was accidentally ignited and they burned immediately to death in an environment of pure hydrogen, or pure oxygen. Now, that illustrates that here are two elements that are basic and they seem like they should be good, but boy, if they're not combined correctly, they're dangerous. But when they're combined correctly in a balanced way, I worked that in because I really needed that. But when they're combined together in a balanced way, they're life-giving. The most life-giving substance on the planet, when two very dangerous things are combined in the proper balance, that's what we have. Now, when Jesus came, one of the summary statements about his purpose for coming to earth is he came to deliver two things: grace and truth. Either one by themselves can be ruinous. A person can only have truth applied to their lives and be destroyed. You can use it as a club to kill somebody with the truth if it has no grace combined with it. Grace can be ruinous if it's not used for the purpose of leading someone back to the truth. It can ruin somebody by just making them think, now I have a license to do what I want because I have grace. Jesus never intended it that way. It was the proper combination of those things through the example and ministry of his life that made him able to say, I'm the water of life. He who comes to me will never thirst. But it was those things properly combined that gave him that quality. Well, let's go on and see what else David said the shepherd would do for him. My shepherd will comfort me when threatened with death. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, I think it's really worth noting in the psalm, if you notice, up until this verse, David is talking about God. At the beginning of this verse, he's talking to God. Now, I've known many people and heard their testimonies of people who've gone through just very grave, life-threatening situations, either personally or maybe with their children, and lived to tell about it. And many of them have said that they never felt closer to God than when they were in that situation and had no one to lean on but him. And I think that's what David was familiar with. That's why all of a sudden God was somebody face to face with him that he was talking to and not about. Now David, we need to see that this was a prophetic psalm. David had no idea how true what he was saying really was because he hadn't seen Jesus. He hadn't known about the coming of the Messiah, but God was certainly saying that through him. Jesus is really the fulfillment of this picture. Jesus compared the kind of, in John chapter 10, Jesus compares his kind of a shepherd to the hireling who is just in it for the money. Because in verse 11, chapter 10 of John, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I'm going to stop there, but you know the rest of it. But Jesus is someone who is with us and helps us through the very, very deepest part of the valley of life. And David, even at a very young age, had learned that. David faced death many times in his life. You know, we're most familiar with when he faced that Philistine giant as a young boy, a giant so imposing and so intimidating that even the most seasoned warriors in Israel shook in their boots and didn't want to even volunteer to go face this guy. And here this young shepherd boy believed that his God was bigger than that giant, because he had learned as a shepherd boy that his God was bigger than that bear who threatened his sheep, that his God was bigger than that lion who threatened his sheep, and he had slain them with God's help. And so he had learned that lesson, that God was with him even when threatened by death. The name of my sermon is My Ancient Shepherd for Modern Pastures. So, can these things really apply to us today? I think maybe this is even more important to point out in this particular point, because we know we're all going to face death. Some of you have faced it and come through, but it's something that we're all going to face. And do we have that kind of a relationship with our shepherd? A lot of you I've shared this with some of you, but it really came close to our family back in January. My brother-in-law had, Tim Siemens in Iowa, had a history of pneumonia, and so when he got COVID, it was a whole different story for him than it was for a lot of people, including my sister, my wife, and I. But after several weeks of care in a hospital in Des Moines, it became obvious that no life support, no intervention was going to do anything except extend his suffering, and nothing was going to make him well. So Tim basically, with his faith in God, took control. And he said, I'm not going to fight it anymore. And I got a text from my sister that we're all going in to say our goodbyes today. And it wasn't until later that I heard the story of how that day went. He has two children besides his wife, 3 grandchildren, and everybody went into his room that day. But when my sister got there in the morning, she was looking at him through the glass window, looking back into his room. And Tim was signing some papers, and she knew what they were for. And he saw her through the window. He glanced up over the paper, and he winked at her. Now that shows you the tone of the day, because he lived his last 5 hours for his family. And he had his grandkids and his kids in the room with him, and he shared with them his dreams for their life. He has 2 grandsons who will probably be on the PGA Tour someday because they're that good of athletes. And he was lived to see his kids, his grandkids excel in those things, and he wouldn't get to see that now. But he prayed with them, and he prayed for them, and he laughed with them, and even had humor with them, told them things that are too personal even to share with you. But after about 5 hours, he said, it's time. So they all left the room, and within 30 minutes, he had gone to be with the Lord. And but his shepherd was with him in the valley of the shadow of death. And how could somebody be that composed and that unselfish at a time when you think somebody would be totally absorbed in self-pity? But he wasn't. His God made him able to live that last few hours for his family and for his loved ones. I've read a lot of Civil War history, and one of the things that was often done in the Civil War when someone died on the battlefield is they would write a letter home to the family of that person who had died, and the one thing that they knew that family wanted to hear in that letter was the statement, he died well. Because they knew what that meant. He died bravely. He died with his faith intact in God and his love for his family. And my brother-in-law died well. And, you know, I hope someday I can do as well when the occasion comes. But that was because he knew his shepherd who was with him even in the valley of the shadow of death. Now, I can't see the clock, so I guess it doesn't matter. So he will shepherd us even when enemies threaten. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The common mode of dealing that enemies attacked their foes in those days was to throw up a siege around the city, to starve them to death. That was the whole goal, was to starve them out, not to kill them all unless they tried to escape, but to starve them to death. And so how much more does this mean when it says he will throw out a banquet for me in the presence of my enemies? Don't know exactly what David meant by that, but that God gave him hope and assurance even when his enemies were the most threatening. He said, not only does he provide for me and give me a banquet, but my cup overflows. So David knew the fullness of hope and assurance, even when his enemies were hoping to deplete him to nothing. We're going to see more and more enemies in our world because of being Christians. I'm just not a prophet. I'm just saying things seem to be going that direction. You know, we need to realize that he will take care of us even when that happens. And we need to be true to him and follow our shepherd even when the world is trying to destroy us, because we do that. I like there's a verse, and I'm sorry I didn't get it on the screen, but it's in Philippians chapter 1, the end of the chapter, where it says that we should not be alarmed in the presence of our enemies, which is a sign of destruction for them and of salvation for us. You know, we see some crazy things going on in the world where people think they have answers that are actually destroying what they say they're trying to save. And, you know, we need to stick to what we know is going to save us and going to sustain us and going to keep us on the path of life no matter how much pressure we feel from the world. That's real easy to say, isn't it, on a Sunday morning? I'm not sure how easy it'll be to do when the time comes, but we need to pray for that, for strength on that day. David concludes his psalm by saying, "My shepherd can always be trusted." God, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Now, David knew hard times and he knew bad times, but he believed that too many of us are tempted to think that when life is bad, that God is bad. When life is hard, that God is being hard on us. But it's not true. God is good all the time. God is always looking out for our greatest welfare, but sometimes He allows us to go through things that we don't want to go through, but He's still going to use it on our behalf. We have to believe that and trust that. Even Jesus struggled with this, didn't He? Life didn't always go the way Jesus would have liked it. His flesh wanted the things that we want in many ways. When He was in the garden, He said, "Let this cup pass from me. I don't want to do this, Lord." That's the way He really felt. When on the cross, He said, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And so He struggled with the same thing. Do we ever feel forsaken? I think there's probably times we are tempted to think that. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. Peter says, and while about Jesus, how He handled this, he said, "And while being abusively insulted, He did not insult in return. While suffering, He did not threaten, but He kept entrusting Himself to Him who judges righteously." He trusted God. End of the matter. He believed and trusted God. Just close with this simple little story. Stories told about a Sunday school teacher who was teaching her young grade school children the 23rd Psalm. And so after they'd studied it for a period of time and they tried to memorize it, she invited anybody who wanted to get up and to say the 23rd Psalm, to quote it. Well, this little girl was barely 5 years old and wanted to participate, so she volunteered to get up. And she didn't go very far, but she said a lot. As she started to quote the psalm, she said, "The Lord is my shepherd. That's all I want." Doesn't that kind of summarize what David was saying in this psalm? That's all I want. It's hard to be that content in a world where there's so many things offered to us and so many things to distract us and to make us think we need those things. But when it comes right down to it, it's all an empty promise. Only the shepherd can give us what we need and want without regret down the road. We're not going to have as such a closing prayer today, but Joni and I are going to share a song with you, and I'll invite you to bow your head if you want to. We want to share something with you just to kind of wrap up our look at the 23rd Psalm. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. In pastures green I lie. He leadeth me by waters still, the quiet waters by. My soul He doth restore again. In righteous paths He leads, for the sake of His own name, for His own name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with with me. Thy rod and staff, they comfort me. A table thou dost prepare in presence of my foes. My head with oil thou dost anoint, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.